inside of there. You'll find that your whole treasurer's job, your trustee job, is found in paragraphs 2525 through 2552. And so inside the discipline, you'll find that. I'm going to leave with y'all. I forgot to do this with the trustees, the finance committee. I brought the guidelines for trustees. This is a pretty neat little book that's written out there. What I suggest, Larry, and I understand you're the trustee chair, is that pass this book around with the trustees and let everybody sign off when they've read it. It's a real simple read. It's not but about 29 pages. I think that's what that says. Yeah, the guidelines from.
They put guidelines for each position from all, as they email them to.
Oh, okay.
That's all they gotta do is print out, but all they gotta do is just print out a copy of it.
All right, good. That and so wonderful. All right. There is another book that I'm going to leave with Cynthia for the library. It's this one says 2018 tax guide. It's more than a tax guide. It'll answer questions about how you use property and what you do with property and that type thing. It's really good. I call this the Sears and Roebuck catalog of what you want to know. And then there's a smaller one, which would be kind of like this one. It's the Reader's Digest version. So there are two sets of it. I'm going to leave this with you. The tax-wise, it hadn't changed much. Cynthia, I think this is one I gave as the cabinet. But I saw this one and thought y'all might like to have that. So as we think about being the keeper of God's house, we're the agent of the physical resources and legal matters. And so we have that fiduciary responsibility to do the things we're supposed to do. We receive direction and we're responsible for the incorporation of the church. I've got a packet of information on this is one. It's very important for y'all to consider having the church incorporated. And so I think the first question I want to ask is, are we an incorporated church at this point? We are incorporated. Okay, good. So you've worked through this. This will be important to you to have the rules about incorporation. But remember, being incorporated, I have got to not only be incorporated, but I've got to act like an incorporation, which means that every January, when you have your required trustee meeting, you're going to elect the trustees to become the directors of the corporation. And when the corporation meets to approve signing off on loans or things like that, be sure you have the minutes. The judge is going to ask you, is there any minutes that represent this if you find yourself in a court case? So let's say we hired somebody to do some work on the building and they didn't do the right work and you ended up suing them because they hadn't done it right. And the judge is going to say, where's the contract? And if there's not a contract that's signed and in the minutes, that's where you find yourself in trouble. So as the lawyers like to say, if your corporation, act like a corporation, keep your minutes, have your required meetings, and do the things that you need to do. And you're going to find all of that inside your bylaws. So please be certain that once you incorporate, you also keep up with the rest of the information as you're going along. You oversee, maintain, and supervise all the local church property. Everything falls underneath you as the legal arm of the church. Now, you can have committees that pick up with it. Let's take the memorial fund. You're responsible for receiving gifts to the church. So you see that receive and administer gifts. Gifts is a little misleading in this because gifts sound like the Sunday morning offering. It sounds like anything that comes in, and that's not right. The gifts are things that come through inheritance. You receive those, and then you are the ones that have the responsibility for caring for that. That's where the memorial funds normally come from. Is the church will establish a memorial fund and the trustees have oversight of it, but the memorial fund committee would go in and take care of, how are we going to spend it? What do we need to do? And work with it that way. So while y'all are responsible for all of it, you can have subcommittees that are able to do that. And you report annually to the charge conference. It's very important in that reporting to the charge conference, because that discharges your duties during the year to make sure that you have really lived into the things you're required to do. This year is going to even be more important. We'll talk about it in a few minutes about your facilities use agreements of where you're allowing people to use the church. There is going to be a reporting process that we've got to know who you've allowed to use the church and did you have this agreement? And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. You ensure the updating of the property. It's your responsibility to keep a look at the property. You don't want to let deferred maintenance get in your way of mission and ministry. And we have a number of churches, and y'all got a great facility out here, beautiful new building. And this building looks like it's almost new also. Other than I know it was here in 2002 when I came. So I know it's that old anyway. But y'all have done a wonderful job with it. But little churches get in trouble, and not just little ones, big churches get in trouble by not keeping up the maintenance on the property. So I think it's real important for trustees to tour the property on a regular scheduled basis. Let's walk through, let's look, let's check the things out. You don't have a parsonage, so you don't have that responsibility, but you do have this building and to go through and, look at the ceiling as you're walking through, look at the windows. Are we leaking air or water coming in? Do we have a possibility of flooding? You've got that responsibility. You work with the pastor on the use of the property. The pastor is responsible for the United Methodist connection to the building and can say who stands in that pulpit. Because the pulpit belongs to the United Methodist Church. So the pastor is responsible for that, but also the trustees have got to be sure that things are right. So you work very closely with that pastor. Cynthia, are you on the trustees officially?
I'm on the trustees here.
Okay.
Okay.
So that the Henderson Raspberry, y'all remember Henderson, he was your district superintendent for a while. Henderson always said, be sure the pastor is on the trustees, because if the pastor's not on the trustees, they come to the meeting, they have voice and everything, but they can't vote. So I really always encourage having the pastor as a member of the trustees. Y'all submit a budget request just like any other committee does. Remember, the budget has to pay all the operating expenses. You can't let the building fund pay the insurance. You can't let it pay the lights, gas, and water. People get confused on that. But the building fund can only pay improvements or major repairs. But if you got to pay $1,000 deductible because a window got broken or something, that's got to come out of your budget. So be sure when you request your budget, you get all of those pieces in there. Insurance, deductibles that you think you're going to have, and lights, gas, water, that type thing. And it kind of depends on how finance committee, and some of y'all were sitting here with finance earlier, kind of depends on how finance puts that budget together. Sometimes finance committee will have the utilities under them, but you want to look at, if they do have it under them, look at that and make sure it is adequate so that we don't run over in that, because you know what's going on. And also, as you begin to look at those utilities, you'll know if there's leaking cold air coming in the building or lights being left on after everybody leaves. A lot of people think that if you turn off all these fluorescent lights, you're saving money every time you turn them off and turn them on. When in reality, if you'll leave them on the whole time and then turn them off when you leave for the night, you come out better. It's more expensive turning them on than it is leaving them on during the time. So you want to think through that. You've got to be accessible and accountable to charge conference and the church council. So trustees, there's a lot of churches that think the trustees run the whole thing, just like a lot of finance committees think they run the whole thing. But remember that we all, in all committees, are reportable to the admin council. So everything's going to go back through there as you're going along. The trustee chair's job is to give the work of the trustees, guide that work of what we're doing. And so Larry, as being on trustees for a while, it's up to you to be sure you've got people assigned to different areas. You've got everything being watched, making sure that they're doing the things they need to do, and then give them advice and direction. It's really important. And just one of the odd things out there that kind of fit in everything else you do. But had a church one time, they had a water leak going, pipes had frozen, they got to church, water was running out the door. Nobody knew where to turn the water off. Nobody had ever thought, and the chair of trustees was not there. And so they couldn't get the water turned off, stop the water running out of the busted pipes. So, you need to tour the building. You need to know how to turn the lights on, turn the lights off. If I need to disconnect the whole electrical system coming into the building, if there's a fire or something that's going on. So y'all as trustees need to know where all of that is. You're the keeper of the building. And you as the trustee chair serve on the church council. Now on the finance committee, you can give somebody the authority to serve on the finance committee as a trustee. But the trustee chair serves on the admin council. So we want to be sure that those are in place. To whom do the trustees relate? Charge conference, that's the primary governing body, the church council, staff parish responsible for all the appointed and hired staff building and equipment needs. And so if the pastor comes up that we need to put in a whole new internet system that makes everybody happy, it's going to come back to you to figure out how we do that. So we want to be sure that those things are coming to the right place. And then with the finance committee, as you help them raise, manage, and disperse the funds. So you see, you relate to everybody out there. So you're not the boss of the group, but you're responsible to all these different groups as they work along. Trustees have to be of legal age. We're very strong in being sure we have young folks serving on all the committees of the church, except the trustees. And that's because you'll be signing contracts, and people that have not reached their majority can't sign contracts and can't vote on contracts. So that's the reason everybody has to be of legal age. There's nothing wrong with inviting young folks to sit in and listen how the trustees work and see how things go. You'll have some kids that will say, gosh, how does this really happen? Invite them into the trustee meeting, let them see how it works. Just don't make them a member of the committee. And that really falls back to Cynthia as chair of the nominations committee to be sure we have that. And the discipline is very specific with trustees, and it's because of your legal authority that's in there. There's got to be at least 3, but no more than 9. So somewhere between 3 and 9 becomes my number. And 2/3 have got to be professing members of the United Methodist Church, which is kind of interesting that I can reach out and bring in a non-United Methodist to serve on my trustees. You can do that because you may not have that expertise that you need in the church. And so I may invite somebody that understands the plumbing. We may be having plumbing problems. And so we invite somebody to come in and help us. We may be looking at an energy audit or something like that, kind of take that up. So you can have 1/3 of them that are, 2/3 have got to be professing members. So 1/3 can come out of other churches. And there's got to be at least 1/3 lay women, 1/3 lay men of the church. So the other 1/3 can come from male or female, doesn't matter. But we've got to be certain that we have full representation on that. But the chairperson's got to be a member of the local church. So you can't invite somebody in to come and then make them the chairperson. It's got to be a local member, and no pastor is a voting member unless elected as a member. So that becomes important to that. So you see kind of how you're organized, and the organization is totally built around the fact that we're the legal arm and we have to sign contracts. The term is a 3-year term. That's a little interesting and different than some of the other committees that become quadrennial terms. You've got a 3-year term, and you divide the board into classes, which if you think about it, 3 or 9, I might have 1 in each class or 2 in each class. And that provides for the longevity of the committee. We don't lose that historical knowledge that's going on inside of there. So I would want my chair coming out of the ones that are going to leave the next year. And I would want my vice chair coming in at least in the 2nd class, so that they've learned a little as I started, but yet I'm learning as I go along. And next year, if I become the chair, then I've had 2 good years of service. So play that really wise as you go along. Charge conference fills the vacancies that occur in the class. So you as trustees can't say, oh, we're going to invite Vicki to come become a member. of trustees. We're going to invite David to be a member of the trust. We can't do that. Charge conference has to make the vacancies filled. And again, it's because of your authority as the legal arm of the church. And so the legal arm of the church that makes the appointments to the different jobs, that's where it's got to come from. And board elects their own officers at the first meeting. So the charge conference can't say we're going to put David on the committee and David's going to be the chair. No, you as the board of trustees will make that decision. So to get organized, there's got to be a meeting in the first 30 days of every month of every year. So I'm going to have my first meeting in January, and then we're going to begin to move forward. We're going to elect our officers. We're going to develop our schedule of meeting. We're going to tour the facility, make sure everybody knows where they are. If there's a key hidden outside on how to get in the building. Here's where the key is in case something's happening in the building, we need to get in. Or do all the trustees have a key to the building? You're going to have to begin to make those decisions. How do we gain access to the property as the trustees? Because that's where the requirement's going to come. I was a member of a little church, and everybody in town, Methodists and non-Methodists, had keys to our building. And I was just put out over that. And I asked one day, why are we doing that? And so a renowned pastor that y'all have served on the cabinet with, that was my pastor, he talked to the trustees. They agreed they needed new keys. So they went out and they got all the keys recut, changed all the locks, spent $1,000 or so doing it. And they handed one person a key. And within 45 minutes, he had gone and made 30 keys and delivered them to all his friends. You know, you as trustees got to figure out, how do we protect this building? Because that's our job. We're protecting God's house. Trustees ought to meet at least quarterly, but they're required to meet annually. And if everything's rocking along good, I guess I could make it annually, but it sure is hard to develop a budget and keep things going. And that's kind of where trustees get a little off base. Somebody will take charge of caring for something. And if there's no meetings going on, the committee as a whole doesn't know what's happening. So really, quarterly is the least I would allow my trustees to meet if I was chair of trustees, or if I was a trustee. I would push and say we need to meet at least quarterly. But there again, if we're in a building project, we find ourselves meeting weekly as we begin to watch the construction. And y'all have gone through that with your new building and how we did that. We've talked about incorporation. In the United Methodist Church, whoever attends a meeting of a committee, the people that are there are the quorum. We don't have to meet a legal quorum. As trustees, you do have to have a quorum to do business. So be absolutely certain when you start the meeting that you determine, do we have a quorum? And a quorum is a half. Divide the trustees into subgroups. You know, that's a good way to care for the property. Y'all got a lot of facility here. And so, you know, who's going to watch over the utilities? Who's going to watch over the buildings? Who's going to be responsible for checking the sidewalks, looking at that? You know, how do we begin to do those things? Who's going to look at the insurance policy to be sure it's adequate? So I might divide into subcommittees in there, but I would organize in a way, Larry, so that as you begin to look at what needs to be done, you know who you can call on to say, have y'all done or have you reported in? It keeps you from getting stuck with everything and then not having somebody that can step in behind it. So committees are important to work with that. Only the chairperson or the pastor can call the meeting. So a meeting that's called by 2 or 3 trustees, and I've seen little churches play the game. 2 or 3 of them will get together, and the pastor and the chair, they want to paint that building green down there, and we don't like it. So let's meet without them and decide we're going to paint it white. That's an illegal meeting, and you can't do it because the pastor or the chair has got to call it. And it's according to paragraph 2532. So we need to be sure we're watching that. The property and casualty insurance is important. Remember that y'all have the insurance right now outside of the annual conference. You've got your own policy. You want to be sure that you're meeting the required minimum standards, because if you don't, for trustees, here's where the problem comes in. If you decide that we're going to have a $500,000 liability policy if somebody slips and falls and breaks a hip or something out there, and so you write your policy at $500,000, and the conference says you're supposed to have $1 million. Well, somebody falls, breaks something, sues, and they sue for $750,000. Well, you got insurance for $500,000. The other $250,000, you could become individually liable for that because you failed to follow what you're doing. So please be careful with that. Make sure that you've got the required limits. Now, there is a proposal, I've had phone calls on this one, that GCFA came out and authorized having less than $1 million in coverage. And you can imagine these small churches that are just one room that's a sanctuary, they may have an office in the back or a kitchen in the back or something. They don't understand why they need $1 million. They call and say, why can't we have 250,000? Well, the rule right now is because annual conference says you got to have $1 million, you got to have $1 million. So we'll be talking about that at the upcoming annual conference and making a decision what we're going to do. And I was telling Maudine earlier that conference trustees will be meeting to have that conversation. The biggest scare for me, if I was you sitting as the trustee of this church, is that if a small church has $250,000 in insurance and they get sued and their money's used up in that, and they sue for more than the annual conference is going to get hit, that ascending liability, which then ends up, it could come back on the other churches. And so we've got to be really careful that everybody has what they're supposed to have, so that, because if we lowered that limit, then we would solve the problem. You wouldn't be liable, but is everybody then liable because of something that happened at one of the churches? So you'll hear that coming out of there, and it'd be related to the trustees, and we'll have conversation around it. The property is used with the pastor's approval. Need to be sure that we understand that part of it, because we've got to be certain, and the bishop is looking at the pastor to be sure that the things that we as United Methodists believe are not being thrown out by who's using our building. So we really want to be careful with that. And we're going to look at a building use agreement in just a minute. Annual inspection of parsonage, y'all don't have one, so we don't have to worry about that. Receive and administer all bequests of the local church. That was the part we were talking about, that you could put that into a memorial fund. You still have oversight for it, or you as the trustees can handle that. So how do we handle the bequests that come to the local church? And if somebody leaves $1,000 to the church, then the memorial fund or the trustees will say to the finance committee, here's where this money needs to go. We need it inside of the building fund. We're trying to pay the note off, or we need it inside a maintenance fund or something like that. So those are inside of that. This accessibility audit and inspection is really pretty interesting. Somebody said, we need to look at it because we need to know how we get in and out of the building. Well, no, all of us walked in the building. We were able to come in. Do you have your building accessible to people that can't come in the building except through a wheelchair or something in that line? Beautiful church over in the Delta. It's got 18 steps till you get to the top. Well, they said, we can go in the back door. I said, yeah, but when you get in the back door, you got about 48 steps to get up there. They had never thought about people not being able to go to church in the sanctuary that was in the top room. So how'd they solve it? They set up a room downstairs that was in the sanctuary till they could get wheelchair ramps in place to get people there. So we got to be really careful. We also want to make sure that trustees, I had another situation in a church that a lady came, she stopped as she passed by the church to come to church. She went up the steps, and when she went in the door, she told the usher that was standing there, she said, that's a long way up. I'm just worn out. They realized that, and when she said she was fixing to go get her son to come into church too, they said, let us go out and help. Let us go get him for you. We'll take a note to him. Let us help you. And she refused. And so they let her go ahead and go out the door. And she fell halfway down the steps. Big lawsuit now going on. So trustees need to be able to say, okay, we need to make sure we've got accessibility to this church, but safe accessibility to it. And so you have to kind of think through those things. So that inspection is very important. Incorporation, y'all are incorporated, so we could kind of jump over there. Here's where it becomes important, this building use policy, and it's actually on the back of your handout. This building use policy needs to be used by everybody that uses the church that is not a committee of the church. So if the United Methodist Women are meeting here, we don't need a facilities use agreement with them. But if Mothers Against Drunk Drivers are meeting here, or Alcoholics Anonymous, or something in that line's meeting here, we need to have an agreement with them on what they're doing. So every group outside the church has got to sign one, and you have to list those meetings in your charge conference. So Cynthia, this is something new that you'll see coming in this year, that on those forms, trustees are going to have to list that they have that. And you'll have to indicate if you have an agreement or not. First year, I'm expecting the DSs to look at those pretty closely, or have somebody that's looking at them in the districts. Even if it's one of us trustees, Maudine, that we have to begin to look at that. And this really came out of the trustees, conference trustee. And Maudine's a conference trustee. I don't know if y'all need that or not. Maudine is a conference trustee. We want to be sure that every group that's meeting has one of these on hand. It talks about our certificate of insurance. If Mothers Against Drunk Driving is meeting here and something happens to one of them, then their insurance coverage needs to cover first, and then ours comes behind it. Or if they don't have insurance, then we need to be able to make a decision. Do we want to have them in the building, even though they don't have insurance? And so ministry versus good decisions being made, I've got to think through those. The certificate insurance, the contractors and outside vendors that are coming in, the church as an additional insurance has got to be listed on there. I require in everything that happens inside of any of our buildings, conference level wide, that they have us as additional insured. Because you think about it, what's going to happen is this: the Mothers Against Drunk Drivers are going to get sued. And then who's next? The trustees of Aldersgate. And so if you're listed as an additional insured, at least you got access to that insurance as time goes along down through this. So I want to be really certain that I have that in place. So this would be those that are just meeting a one-shot deal. There may be somebody coming in that's going to have some kind of meeting. They're looking for a church to go to. Have it for them. And if it's Mothers Against Drunk Drivers or it's Alcoholics Anonymous that are meeting weekly or monthly, the form gives you the ability to say how often they're meeting, what staff person is going to be responsible for them that are meeting, and who's going to be there during the meeting. You can't hand somebody a key to your property and say, just use it as you will, because you have people using your property that are not members. So what if something happens? Now I'm fixing to get sued. The use policy for groups, for internal and external, we want to be certain that we use that, in the group signage signs the usage agreement. So somebody that's responsible with whoever I'm working with. So if it's the Mississippi Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, or if it's a Jackson chapter or something like that, make sure that whoever signs that agreement with you does the signing. Get the limits of insurance and their certificates, update them annually. So if I've got, and I just keep picking on Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, if they're there for 10 years, I want a new agreement every year inside there, because if they run forever, it's like they're just part of us and we're not getting our agreements renewed each year. There's a segregating groups to specific areas. If you've got a youth event going on, and Vicki will get into this real well in just a few minutes, but if you've got a youth group going on, I would not want anybody in where they are to make sure there's no offenses against any of the youth or the children or the vulnerable adults. And she'll get into that. Be sure that you're opening and closing the facilities with groups. How do we do that? Who is the person in charge? We have a rule at the conference office. We got the Wilson Annex out back, and you're certainly willing to and welcome to use it. But we require a staff member to be on site the whole time the meeting's held. They don't have to sit in your meeting, but they've got to be there to open and close the building. So that's what this building facilities use agreement comes from. And I'll be quite honest with you, this is coming out of the Boy Scout thing. What happened with this Boy Scout thing was we chartered the entities, but we did not accept the fact we were their parent, if you will. We were responsible for them. They were part of our group, but we never had any rules or regulations on how they did. We didn't look at their finances. We didn't do any of those things. And so this is where this is coming from. The litigious society in which we live will get us in trouble. And we've seen that. Our share as United Methodist in that Boy Scout lawsuit cost the denomination $30 million. And so we want to be careful. The last thing you need is somebody filing against you and using your insurance and then getting above that. And then we hadn't done the things as we should have, and then who becomes liable? The beauty of what you've done as trustees being incorporated is that they cannot sue for more than the corporation has. Whereas an unincorporated entity, they'll sue for everything that unincorporated entity has. And then the next step